Hi, everyone. I'm Mickey, an interviewer for the Post Hole, the student-run journal of archaeology at the University of York. And joining me today from his home in Ireland is John Sunderland, artist, geographer, and archaeologist. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. Nice to be along.
I'll just give you some quick background. John trained as a field archaeologist before pursuing degrees in fine arts, which culminated in a PhD. He is a founding member of the Praxis Collective, which uses collaborations between science and art to address contemporary issues. And he has led, as he very beautifully put it, interweaving careers in visual art and archaeology. And that's where I would like to start. My first question is, artist, geographer, archaeologist, are those titles in an intentional order?
Oh, no, I would say not. No, that's just how it happened. I would have started really kind of as an archaeologist, then become an artist, and then become a geographer, really. And the geography probably only within the last 5 or 6 years as a recognition, as almost saying, right, oh God, I'm actually a geographer. Because I was going and giving presentations at geography conferences, and I asked actually a couple of people, could I actually describe myself as a geographer? And they said, you deal with all of the things that geographers do, so you are actually a geographer. And in ways that I actually have output as well, sort of in conference papers and all these kinds of academic output is pretty much the same in a way as a geographer would put out across. So I realized I was a geographer, which is good in a way.
I think that's great. I think that sort of speaks to the way your career path has evolved over time. And so the obvious question is, when you first started training in archaeology, did you ever imagine you would end up where you are today and claiming these other titles?
No, I didn't at all. I really wasn't sort of drawn to archaeology as a career path at all. It came to me because I was unemployed and I was looking for some employment, something to do after doing my kind of sixth form college qualifications in the 1980s. And I saw this advert for an environmental technician on a scheme, which was basically 3 days a week for an extra tenner. And I went along and it was just fantastic. I mean, it was really a great grounding in the craft of archaeology and some extra training in environmental stuff, environmental technician work, which was also something I do a lot now too. So it's all very much kind of case of it finding me, I think, in a way, rather than me thinking early on in my life that I wanted to be an archaeologist. I think that was it was one of those things that being outside, being physical, in the landscape, engaging with the landscape, just completely gave me a buzz. And from then, that kind of led into the arts practice as well, kind of linked it all together in a way. So yeah, I didn't think at the start of my career that I would either be in Ireland, because archaeology brought me to Ireland, or really working in such a way that the two subjects are actually hybridizing. Because I did initially find that the archaeology was separate from the arts practice, almost as if one was an empirical, evidence-based activity, the other one was about poetics, perhaps, and about my own kind of subjective interpretation. But now I can actually see ways that the two combine, and that archaeology is also a kind of experientially subjective field. Does that make sense?
No, that's great, because I think a lot of us do think of, oh, well, I'm a buildings archaeologist. I also like to take artsy photos, and those two things are two different things, versus how they can be applied together. No, I think that's great. And I do want to give you a chance to talk about your work. I know you want to tell us about a particularly challenging project you've been tackling.
Yeah, last year. Oh, yeah. Well, last year I was working with the guys from Praxis, who were doing this thing called the glass hack, which was bringing glass art makers together with scientists to do research. And it was set in Sweden, deep in the forests of Småland. And there's this factory in this tiny village, and it's surrounded by forest. You can't walk out of the forest in a day. It's just right in the middle of nowhere, really kind of remote. But this factory used to run there since 1864, and it shut down in 2003. So the whole place was just like, from having 200 employees, it went down to 0. And then in 2011, it was opened up again as a kind of research center and museum with about 20 employees. But I was asked along there as part of this project to talk about social science. So to talk about how archaeology was kind of intermeshed with my arts practice, and to talk about specific projects. So I kind of went there and went, okay, I'll give a talk. And I gave my talk, and the director of the place said, do you want to come back and do some work here? And I went, yeah, what should we do? What can we do? And to cut a long story short, I started doing a project which was about the rural depopulation that is taking place in that region as a result of the end of the industrial glass production, and to start to study the processes that were going on there of the buildings, mostly the homes, becoming abandoned. And so that led me to go out into the forest and into the village and into empty buildings and to document them. So I was asked to go back. So I went back beginning of July, but by the middle of September, the project was finished and there was an exhibition up.
Wow, that's
so with a little bit of break, it was 10.5 weeks from the start of the project to its kind of first iteration as a solo exhibition, with kind of installation works, photography, drawing, mapping. So I didn't know what I was getting into when I started that project. The first thing that came to me when I was there in March last year was the forest, and that the forest had this kind of darkness about it that I was really drawn to, and really attracted to this kind of sense of this kind of mystery that the forest represented, something that was almost like prehistoric to me. When I first came across it, I thought, God, this really looks like a Bronze Age landscape. It really feels there's these kind of lakes and then just forests. There's no full of field boundaries. And then you kind of work around it and you think, God, it's amazing. And you kind of get a bit frightened sometimes because it's quite creepy. And I sort of thought, well, that's kind of really interesting. And as I kind of got into this project, I thought, well, I'm kind of, that initial feeling of darkness and of fear was something I'm sure was reflected in the people living there in some respects. That there was a deep kind of psychological connection to the landscape, to the forestscape, and to the fact that they were kind of in this place that they lived. They loved it, but they were also aware of its darkness. And I really did kind of get into the darkness of that place. I found 9 sites which I studied, and the kind of archaeological way this was working out, in a kind of contemporary archaeology way, was it really became a study of what happens when houses go from being occupied to being destroyed, with all the stages. So each of the 9 houses represent that stage. And the first one house is occupied by this guy who's 78, who used to work in the glass factory, who has no furniture, no running water, no electricity, and lives in this 19th century wood house in the forest there. And he was completely eccentric. He used to keep horses in the house with him.
That's great. Well, I know we could talk about this all day long.
Go on all day, but the thing was that, so I was really challenged because the landscape had so much material in it. So from an archaeological perspective, it was impossible to take it all in. So you had to kind of really work through this. And I was using deep mapping as a kind of benchmark for it, which meant really looking at it was that nothing that I encountered was thrown out of the project. It always just came into it. So it just built and built and built. So it was incredibly challenging to put it all together. And I didn't have enough time in the process to have any sort of gestation or thinking period.
Mm.
So I was running sort of 12-hour days, 7 days a week in the last month, all the way through to the final show being up. And that was just a totally amazingly challenging experience, really, really enriching, really, really useful. Now I'm kind of writing it up, if you know what I mean, as an archaeologist would. So I'm kind of working out all the different discourses and dialogues that I have had about that project. So yeah, that was really challenging, really enriching, useful kind of project.
Oh, that's great. Well, we'll use that as a little teaser to tell people to go to visit your website, johnsunderland.com, where you will be posting more information about that in the near future. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to learning more about that. Well, unfortunately, we have a very brief amount of time with you today, which is a shame. But what you've had to say has just been really interesting. I will just say, is there anything else you want to say to new archaeologists, you know, as they sort of consider creating diversity in their careers, whether that's multiple income streams or multiple interests, you know?
Yeah. I think it's you could easily get sort of channeled down into commercial archaeology through an archaeological career. And I've worked in commercial archaeology for many years and sort of struggled with those frustrations. But I think that the key kind of thing that came out of that for me was to actually understand that I'm often dealing with landscapes, cityscapes, buildingscapes when I'm doing this, and that an incredible amount of different disciplines actually come into play when you look at those kind of areas, those spaces and places. And the important thing is to sort of say, right, actually, what are other people saying about this? What are other disciplines doing? And try to break down those barriers so that you get a bigger, more holistic kind of look. So you've got sociology, geography, ecology, art, history, all these different disciplines can actually enrich your research practices within looking at archaeological material. And make, I think that sort of thing is what inspires me, and it makes your audience bigger too, because you actually pull it out into these different spaces. You have different types of discourse that you can use to actually discuss your enthusiasm for the subject that you're working with. So you can then kind of appeal to people, and it crosses over, and it becomes a sharing of enthusiasms.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. We appreciate you sharing your experience with us, and wish you well as you continue to work on your projects.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you to invite me to come and talk. Cheers.